Hello, and we are back in Chapter 3, and we're going to specifically focus on the Commerce Clause in this lecture, and then we're going to talk about the Takings Clause as well, because these are two important constitutional powers that the federal government have that affects a lot of business, okay? So remember we talked about the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Well, one of them is to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with the Indian tribes. And so they have that power. Any statutes that fall within that gamut, they pretty much can pass the regulation. The kicker of most of their powers is there's this one power basically that says that the government can make any laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and the other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department of office or thereof. So basically what it's saying is, hey, if we give you a power, do whatever you need to whatever you think you need to do to regulate, whatever's necessary and proper, you can do. And what's interesting about this is you're going to see how broad the commerce power is. So remember, if both federal and state regulate commerce, then federal trumps. So the states can have their own regulations that affect commerce in their state, right? And that would be separate from the federal government because the federal government can regulate commerce that crosses state lines. But that's what the Constitution says. But over time, case law said, well, wait a second. We're going to also let you regulate commerce inside a state if it affects interstate commerce. So now what we have is where the state had the power to regulate all the commerce within their state, but they couldn't regulate the commerce between states. The federal government was to regulate that. Well, they have interpreted case law and precedent says, yeah, but you know what? If your regulations affect interstate commerce, then federal government has the power for that. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about what we call the Dormant Commerce Clause. And what that means is the states can't burden interstate commerce or discriminate against interstate commerce. So if they do state regulations, even though their regulation is only in their state, but if it puts a burden on interstate commerce, the federal government can trump that and say, no, we're not going to let you do that. So the federal powers are to regulate commerce within the foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So and we're going to talk about that among. But first, let's talk about really what it means for commerce, right? What do we mean? What is commerce? Well, the Supreme Court law has basically said that when we're talking about interstate commerce, we're talking about movements of persons and things, whether for profit or not. So if we can say things are moving and not, and it's moving across state lines, communications, transmissions of intelligence, whether for commercial purposes or otherwise, and commercial negotiations that involve transportation of persons or things or flows of services or power across state lines, we're going to consider that commerce. So that is how the federal government has even expanded it more, because not only is it just talking about commerce, we're talking about things that don't even have to be a profit. They have defined as commerce. So they can regulate commerce with foreign and among the several states. So what the Constitution basically is saying, interstate commerce occurs between parties from different states. And that's what among the states should be, the different states. Intrastate is between parties within the same state. So what had happened is the states were regulating their commerce and cases were coming up and the court said, okay, wait a second. You can regulate commerce, And you have police power to regulate health, safety, and welfare of your citizenry, but you cannot benefit in-state economic interests by burdening out-of-state competitors. So basically what's saying is state, we're not going to let you be your own place. We're not going to let you compete with yourself, with the other states. You have to be part of a united nation. And so one of the cases is in 1935, and there were New York laws that barred out-of-state dairy farmers from selling their milk in the state unless the price paid to them matched the premium price New York law guaranteed, and state producers said, you know what, we're not going to let you bring in your cheap milk and compete against our in-state people. And what they said is, what the dairy farmers were saying is basically, we're just giving our farmers a benefit. But what the Supreme Court said is, yeah, and what you're doing is you're deliberately robbing out-of-state farmers the opportunity to sell lower prices in New York and take advantage of their natural competitive advantage they might have. And we're not going to let that happen. So you cannot do that. You cannot require them to have the same rates that your New York people have. And in that decision, Justice Cardozo wrote for the court, the Constitution was framed upon the theory that the people of the several states must sink or swim together, and that in the long run, prosperity and salvation are in union and not in division. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Dormant Commerce Clause. You can't discriminate against another state when it comes to commerce. So to determine whether it violates the Commerce Clause, the state regulation, we determine whether the regulation discriminates against the commerce of other states. Haley v. Beer. The Supreme Court struck down a Connecticut law because it required out-of-state beer merchants to affirm that their in-state prices were no higher than those they charged in neighboring states. Okay? So basically it was saying, well, you need to make sure that your in-state prices are no higher than you charge in other states. And what it said is the essential vice in laws like Connecticut is that they hoard commerce for the benefit of in-state merchants and discourage consumers from crossing state lines to make their purchases from nearby out-of-state vendors. So that's what they were doing. They were saying, well, you have to sell it as high as our neighbors so that they will have to come to us. And by doing that, even though it's helping our state and we're the ones making the money, you are discriminating against the state next door, because now they're at equal pricing and people aren't going to go to them. And in that decision, and there were many decisions that were very similar to that whole theory. In 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court, and so remember, this is how I'm telling you that our Constitution is so relevant today. It's not just a piece of antiquated paper. Is it the Constitution as it was written? No, but it's still, they go back to it all the time. And the Supreme Court looked at whether or not they were going to broaden the constitutional restrictions on the ability of states and local governments to regulate their goods sold within their borders. Okay. And in that case, there was a law that in California that said you cannot sell whole pork meat that comes from breeding pigs or their offspring that are confined in a cruel manner. Okay. And the breeding pigs can't be confined to stalls so small that the pigs can't lie down, stand up, turn around, things like that. And it was meant to prevent animal cruelty. Okay. And what they said in that case was, well, first the petitioners filed it on behalf of those their members who raise and process pigs. And what they said is California's law doesn't discriminate against anybody because everybody has to do that. It's not just, they're just saying whoever's going to sell in our state you can't be cruel to the pigs, right? If you're an in-stater, you want to sell pork here, you can't be cruel to the pigs. If you're not a stater and you want to sell here, you can't be cruel to the pigs. So it didn't discriminate, but the petitioners didn't like it from other states because they were like, well, why do we have to do this? And they said, and we know it's not discriminatory because discriminatory because it applies to all the states equally. But they wanted them to expand the reading of the Commerce Clause and say, well, what we should do is invalidate laws regardless of any discriminatory purpose or effect on interstate commerce if it burdens commerce. So we just want you, federal government, to say, states, you can't burden commerce in any way if you make regulations. And they said, because if we had to revise our whole system and segregate so that we can comply with Prop 12, that would be a huge burden on us, and it would increase our production costs and our compliance costs. So it's going to be a lot for us to have to do this. And the court said, you know what? No. The government has the ability to regulate for health, safety, and welfare for their citizenry. And the only exception to that is that regulations cannot discriminate against interstate commerce. We are not going to expand this in any way to limit the power of what the state governments can do in their state regulations. So they put their foot down in 2023 and said, listen, as long as you're not discriminating, if you are regulating for health, safety, and welfare, your commerce, we're going to give you the ability to do that. And so this is a very fresh case, and it was a very big win for state governments to be able to regulate commerce. We are going to be talking about the takings clause in the next video, and that will end our lectures for our chapter.